Good afternoon, everyone. I am so happy to see so many of you. And today we have with us Dr. Dante Anthony Tolentino, who is an assistant professor of nursing at UCLA, and his research focuses on reducing health inequities among Filipino Americans. Uh, Dr. Tolentino, take it away.
Thank you, Monica. Hi, everyone. It's nice to see uh, a lot of you today. And thank you for joining me to share our work on sort of leveraging large language models, particularly the use of generative AI. One, to conduct statistical data analysis and any other types of analysis that you would want to do in the future. In particular, I'll present this concept called vibe coding. And hopefully, this is not the first time you're hearing about vibe coding. But if it is, then this will be a good introduction for everyone. So here are the objectives. One is really just to describe vibe coding as sort of an alternative approach to traditional coding. And then hopefully at the end of this, you'll be able to outline three elements of a suggested workflow whenever you're coding, and then identify at least two considerations for responsible use of vibe coding. And again, here's the agenda. We'll define what vibe coding is. We'll talk about some of the suggested workflow. I think an AI talk is not an AI talk without talking about hallucinations. So we'll talk about hallucinations briefly. And then I'll introduce some of the tools that you can use for vibe coding. And then quickly do a sort of a pseudo demo since I've already set it up. But you'll see at least some of the output when using vibe coding. All right, so I guess just a show of hands, has anyone used Gen AI or generative AI or AI, right? So that could be ChatGPT, Gemini, Claude, or whatever you're using to write some of your codes when you're conducting your data analysis. All right, so I'm seeing Jesse, Emily, Prashit. So good. I mean, in essence, that's really what vibe coding is, right? When you're using sort of a lot of these Gen AI to generate your codes. So when you hear then the word vibing, right, what comes to mind? Like I'm vibing right now, maybe not. But
Using
what,
your feelings.
yeah, using your feelings. Good. Anyone else?
I was about to say same thing as what Monica said. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, perfect. And maybe a lot of you currently are like sort of chilling out right now, right? So that's really vibing. You're chilling out, having sort of a good time, hopefully. And this certain kind of energy that you are projecting, right? And sort of getting into or tapping into, as Monica said, this good feeling, just like what Bart Simpson is doing right here. Really, I vibe when I'm listening to some good music while I'm writing. So I sort of have this feeling of vibing when I'm writing. And that's really the heart of vibe coding, right? When you are sort of chilling out. And in this case, when you're vibe coding, you're leaving many of the technicalities of coding to AI. And so now I know all of us have some varying levels of statistical training, right? For many of our colleagues in public health, for example, or epi, psychology, and medicine, definitely very rigorous stat training, right? But for some of us, we went to a profession where math was really never a strong suit, and there was a reason why I went to nursing. And so doing stats, right, has always been a big barrier. And I would say, at least for me, speaking as a neuroscientist, many of us default like to qualitative studies because we've had some traumatic experience when we were doing our statistical training. But Gen AI or generative AI is definitely changing that. Right? So let's just assume you have a compelling research question and you don't know where to begin, or you don't have the time to start coding because of you may have a heavy teaching load this semester or this quarter or any other reasons of procrastinating, which I do every single day. And so what you do is you open your laptop and then type a plain language prompt into this AI chatbot. And in a matter of seconds, as many of you have experienced already, you sort of receive this usable code end results, right? In this sort of hypothetical scenario, data analysis really becomes accessible and empowering. And that's really the possibility with vibe coding. So vibe coding is a term, or was a term that was introduced by Andre Karpathy in early 2025, so just last year, and it was posted in X, of course, where he said that uh, it's a new kind of coding where you fully give in to the vibes, right? Embrace exponentials and forget that the code even exists. And it is possible because large language models are getting too good. And so we'll talk about more of the details about this. But if you don't know Andrei Karpathy, I think he's a good person to follow, but he's a prominent Slovak Canadian computer scientist. He's also an AI researcher and an educator, but he's famous for his work in deep learning, leading AI at Tesla, and he was also a founding member of OpenAI. And so OpenAI is the vendor for ChatGPT. I know very questionable organizations that he worked for, but that's for another discussion, maybe in the future. And so vibe coding then really is just using large language models, right, to code from natural language prompts. That's it. It's like using ChatGPT, very conversational and definitely in sort of this iterative process, but it does not involve a lot of traditional coding. You will still need to know how to read the codes, but it's sort of this paradigm shift where you are focusing more on guiding the output, right, of the AI based on the prompts that you are using compared to what we traditionally do now, where you have to write each line when you are coding. So it's actually used, so vibe coding is used a lot in software development. So think about, the computer engineers, who are building websites or apps. So instead of them writing the code, they use AI to generate a lot of these codes. So it relies heavily on the AI code suggestion with many of these, large language models have used a corpus of data from the internet as its training data. So it's very good at generating a lot of these codes. And so from software development, we are now seeing some of use cases in research, particularly in generating statistical codes for data analysis. So here's a recent paper from Lee and Ha that was just published a few months ago about how clinicians can use vibe coding for machine learning and deep learning research. So it's gaining some traction now in academia and in research. So I, for one, actually learned about vibe coding during my one-year fellowship at the NIH AIMA program, where Dr. Go introduced it to us, who is from Johns Hopkins University, and they said they've actually been using and experimenting a lot with vibe coding in a lot of their data analysis at Johns Hopkins. And as I mentioned, vibe coding really is this paradigm shift to what we do now when we are coding, right? And what do I mean by this paradigm shift? One, it's sort of because you're sort of not doing a lot of these manual coding, it enables sort of this problem first approach, right? That moves your research ideas more quickly from concept to data analysis, which for a lot of people really reduces a lot of the barriers to working with data sets and sort of fosters this efficient way of doing your data analysis. And by lowering a lot of these technical thresholds, particularly in writing codes, it can position you sort of to shift right from coding tasks to more of these higher order reasoning, so allowing you to, again, delegate a lot of the technicalities of coding to the AI, and then you as a researcher can devote more time and attention to the conceptual design of your research, to problem framing, to interpreting a lot of your research results. And so here's I think a great table, again, from the same article from Lee and Ha. And here they outline really the basic differences between vibe coding and traditional coding or traditional programming. So here, as you can see, in terms of code creation, they talk about with traditional programming or traditional coding, you do manual coding line by line. But with vibe coding, again, it's all about AI generation from natural language prompts. And then your role now, right, when you're doing traditional coding, you are sort of the architect, right? You need to know what the codes are. You're implementing those codes and you're sort of debugging if you're having issues with those codes. But now think about sort of a role switch when you're doing vibe coding. Rather than being an architect, implementer, and debugger, you're sort of more now as the prompter. You're guiding the AI, you're testing those codes, and then you're refining those prompts in order to generate the output that you want. And there's other ways to compare traditional programming and vibe coding, and I would highly recommend to read this article if you have the time. Um, and so to me, you're still engaging, right, with the work that you're doing. But again, it's a shift. And I think many of us uh, shifting our role, right, from this architect, implementer to debugger to a prompter, guider, tester, and refiner might be difficult at first. But again, it's a shift in our way of working and thinking when we're doing a lot of this work. So which leads us really to many advantages of using vibe coding. One, it allows you to focus sort of on this overall vision again of your research, right? And doing more of that higher order thinking. And so leaving the code generation to AI. Um, in terms of accessibility, it can lower the barrier for coding, where again, you delegate a lot of the technicalities of coding to the AI and you focus more on the what, right, of your research rather than the how. And so to me, I sort of treat this as if I'm working with my own personal statistician or coder. But I still need to know the work, right? But I don't need to know the technicalities of how to code in order to generate the output that I need. And so as a result, you sort of have this shift again in your role. So instead of you being a code writer, you really become more of a code conductor, as some of the researchers are doing now. And it also allows for rapid coding, which helps with efficiency and speed for your data analysis. But speed is not always good, right? And the use of vibe coding with any generative AI has many disadvantages and limitations. And I think the fear of many is that we all become sort of over reliant on AI, right? For a lot of the things that we're doing now. And so when we're coding, we become more reliant to AI for coding, which for some people might lead to the lack of understanding and context in the generated code and overall process of the work that they're doing. And I would say, that statistical knowledge still remains essential in this process. And you should never, right? You should never use a statistical method or analysis that you have no knowledge of. Another issue with vibe coding is the code quality issues. And what I mean by that is that many of the generated codes may be functional, but it may not be optimized. So for example, if I do, for example, just a simple descriptive stats for my sample characteristics in R, right? I might write an R code with 2 to 3 lines, right? So I might use like the describe function from the psych package and I can get my numerical stats. But when you're doing vibe coding, the AI may produce 20 to 30 lines of codes for this specific request, right? Especially if you did not prompt it correctly or appropriately. And so prompt engineering techniques or prompt engineering skills is really becoming an important skill to have when you're vibe coding or even when you're using any of these generative AI tools, which really leads to very inconsistent approaches in vibe coding where AI sort of might generate different solutions for the same problem. And so that will be a big issue, especially if you're trying to understand the codes that are being uh, generated by vibe coding. Another issue is the lack of project context, right? AI really does not understand your research or your project. Only you as the researcher knows. And so if you did not prompt or provide context to the AI when you're vibe coding, you'll probably produce a lot of hallucinations in your output. And so you really need to be very careful. And of course, which leads us to this issue of hallucination, right? Still a big issue, even when you're vibe coding. However, there are approaches to sort of limit this, and I'll talk more about hallucinations in a second and how to sort of minimize a lot of the issues with hallucination when you're vibe coding. And then, of course, some of those other issues when you're using generative AI in general, right? Environmental and societal costs. We all know that there is high energy consumption, water usage, and e-waste generation when you're using Gen AI. I think you've probably heard that ChatGPT is 10 times as energy intensive as a Google search. And then the massive data centers, right, powering a lot of these AI require a lot of electricity. And this electricity is still coming from a lot of fossil fuels, which contributes to climate change. And so that cycle that we're having, and a lot of these data centers that they're building, uh, I just read something last year where they're displacing a lot of many people, and so exacerbating, the housing crisis that we already have in this country. And so I think just being very mindful when we engage in vibe coding or when we're using any of these generative AI tools. And so the question that you need to ask is, do you really need to use AI to do X, Y, and Z? And if you don't, then maybe don't even engage in any of these tools. And again, I just want to emphasize this because I think this is really important. Vibe coding is not a replacement for deep understanding of your research and also of your own data and your own data analysis, right? I think it's really important to understand the underlying principles of, again, your research, but the code that is being generated by the AI. And you should always be reading the code that's being generated and you're verifying those codes that are being generated by AI. Which leads us sort of to this philosophical concept of augmented knowing, which we are proposing as a form of knowledge production in which we're saying that reality is no longer solely a human generated, but emerges through these sort of dynamic interaction among humans, data, and technologies. But we argue that when you're using generative AI, we're positioning AI as a collaborator that augments, right, rather than replaces human knowledge and judgment. And so here we're saying that we keep the epistemic authority to humans rather than to the AI. And that's really the heart of augmented knowledge, augmented knowing, where human epistemic authority still remains. And to do this, when vibe coding, we suggest several processes be embedded when you're vibe coding, and you can see that in the outer ring of this diagram. And so here, you want to make sure that you have a clear framing of your research question and mapping of your variables when you're coding, as well as a clear data analysis plan. So nothing different of what you're doing now when you're traditionally programming or you're coding, right? You keep that process in place, but you're sort of switching it. Instead of you coding it and keeping it in your brain, you're sort of doing that in a way of prompting your AI to sort of generate a lot of these output. And then two, having a clear project organization and documentation. I think that's really important when you're vibe coding. If you're not sort of very systematic in terms of data analysis and coding, when you're vibe coding, it's going to generate a lot of codes and a lot of project and a lot of files, and you're going to get lost easily. And so it's really important to have some project organization and a lot of documentation in place. And then when and you also need to leverage what they call RAG, or retrieval augmented generation. I'm not sure if anyone has heard of this term, or if you've used this, but with RAG, you're sort of integrating external data sources outside of what has been trained by the model that you're using, the Gen AI model that you're using, but you're sort of integrating external data sources into your vibe coding workflow. And so, for example, if you have code books that you're using, if you have data dictionaries, data documentation, README files, you sort of incorporate that into your project, and you're prompting AI to look at these external files in order to have a more verifiable and reliable output when you're vibe coding. And then making sure that you have a solid prompt engineering techniques. Again, as you are a code conductor now rather than a code writer. And so you have to interact with the AI through the prompts. And so prompting really becomes a very important skill when you're doing vibe coding. And so some of the suggested workflow around that diagram, again, is you need to have a clear vision of your research and break down your analysis into manageable steps. So everything that you're doing now when you're doing your data analysis, that doesn't go away when you're doing vibe coding, right? You need to define your data analysis plan, just like any analysis that you're doing now. So don't let AI do those steps for you because it's easy for that, right? You can just ask AI to ask, well, what steps do I need to do? You still need to have a clear, solid plan moving forward, and don't rely on AI to do that for you. You also need to know your data set, right? What variables you are using in the data set, map your concepts. How are you going to operationalize your concepts with the variables in the data set? Also using the actual variable names in your data set when you're prompting in order to reduce a lot of the hallucinations that are being produced by vibe coding, and making sure that you're keeping all these as part of your vibe coding documentation, right? So often I would keep like a table where I sort of map a lot of these. This is my concept. This is the variable that is in the data set. This is how we're operationalizing them. This is my definition, etc. And so you still keep a lot of those table and you feed that to your project file in your AI, in your Gen AI or your AI code editor when you're vibe coding. And that's really sort of the concept of RAG, or that retrieval augmented generation, where you have code books, load those in your project folder. If you have references, again, data description, README files, you keep all those and you reference a lot of those when you're vibe coding. And which leads us again to prompt engineering. And prompt engineering really is an important skill moving forward. And sort of this is no different, right? When you're searching literature using your Boolean operators, I think the main difference really is when you're doing your Boolean search, as we all know, that's very deterministic. When you're doing prompt engineering, it's very probabilistic, where you're sort of guiding AI to generate the best response. And so to do this, you really need to employ different types of prompt engineering techniques. And you probably heard of a lot of these called zero-shot prompting, one-shot prompting, or few-shot prompting, prompt chaining, iterative prompting, negative prompting. If you haven't heard of those terms, if you don't know, I do have a lot of references or resources to share. If you just want to know on how to do those, I can share those with Monica to share with the group. But prompting really becomes a very critical skill when you're doing vibe coding. And there's different frameworks to do prompting. One that I found very useful and sort of very simple is this framework of context, role, action, and output. And so you want to make sure that when you are writing your prompt, it has all or most of these characteristics, right? And so context is when you sort of provide some background or context, right, for the action that you want to do. Role is to tell the AI who to be. Action is what to do, right? And then output is how you want that information to be given to you. So here's an example, right? Here's a bad prompt if you're doing vibe coding. So if you prompt your AI and just say, write an R code to look at the average of my data group by age, it seems like this is a good one, but really this is bad, right? It's bad because one, you're not specifying any of the data structure specified, right? What are the column names? Again, you want to make sure that you're very specific when you're coding. It's very vague, right? What do we mean by average? There's no package that's specified in this prompt, and there's no sample output. And so how do we make this a better prompt? If we use sort of that context, role, action, output framework, right? You can prompt your AI to say, you will analyze a data set and generate summary statistics. So you're providing your context, right? You want them to analyze the data set and generate a summary statistic. And then you're giving them a role and saying that you're going to act as a data analyst. And then here, the next one is I'm giving some action and further context to what I want this AI to do. So here, I'm saying using Dippler, calculate the mean of salary and age columns, group by department and years, underscore experience, and the data set is named DF, right? So you're sort of still coding in a way, but you're writing it in a prompt. But you're not losing the context of what you want to generate, right? But you're sort of switching from writing the code to just writing it in order for the AI to generate the code for you. And then the output here is only return the code, ensuring it handles missing values, and we code those as NA by removing them, right? And so that's your output. And so this is a better prompt than the first one because it assigns that context role action output. It specifies the library or the libraries that you want. In this case, I'm asking them to use Dippler. It specifies the columns, it handles the missing data, and then it enforces a specific output, right? In this case, I only want the code. And so you can sort of see the difference. You probably can get an output from this prompt, but if you don't do sort of a more explicit prompting when you're doing your Gen AI, it is more prone to hallucination. And so it's really important for you to really execute a better prompting technique when you're using vibe coding. Here's another example. A bad prompt is just clean this date column and make it better. If I'm lazy, I probably do this, but a better way to do this is this, right? You are a data analyst. Again, you're sort of specifying a role, and then you're providing some context here. I have a column named raw underscore date in a data frame called DF. With this format, write an R code using Lubridate and Dippler2, and then these are the outputs that I want. Convert raw date to a date type, extract the month, and create a new column called this output. Filter out any rows where the date is the future, and then provide the code in a single markdown block. So it seems like a lot, right? And you might think, well, let me just code it instead of prompting this. But again, you want to be very explicit in order to get really the output that you want. Again, you probably will get a similar output with this bad prompt, but if you have more complex analysis, having better prompting techniques is really a better way to do it, and that will sort of solidify the output that you're going to get. And so this is one of the resources from MESCO that was published last year. Might be useful if you want to learn more about prompt engineering techniques, even outside of vibe coding. And so I'll share this to Monica if anyone is interested in reading this publication as well. And so I know that one of the biggest challenges, right, when using any large language models or Gen AI is privacy and sharing of data. As with any use of Gen AI, use it with caution and never include identifying information, making sure you use a cleaned or processed data set that at a minimum really strips a lot of these identifying information. The general practice is never upload or share any with those data or information. That said, you can read each tool's privacy and security policy. And some of the things that you want to consider is looking if they're SOC 2 certified, right? SOC 2 certified. SOC 2 really demonstrate sort of this rigorous control for safeguarding customers' data regarding security, regarding the availability, the processing of the data, confidentiality, and privacy through an independent audit. And so check if they're SOC 2 certified. If they're not, don't even bother using it. The other thing that you want to look when you're looking at these policies is, does it collect data from your interactions, right? Including files that you are using for your project. Does it route to a different provider like OpenAI, Google, Claude for processing? So a lot of these sort of providers, even though they're not OpenAI or Gemini, for example, Cursor, for example, right? They still using some underlying models in the backend where they're sort of sending their analysis to these third-party tools. And the question is, what happens to that? Does OpenAI keep that interaction, or do they delete it after your session is gone? So you want to make sure that you're reading a lot of those policies that they have in place. And then check if you can turn on privacy mode so that you can, so that after you are done, right, it removes all the data for you. It won't use the data that you use to engage with that Gen AI for training. So for example, in Cursor, which is an AI tool that's used a lot in vibe coding, you can actually turn on privacy mode. If this is off, you're sort of saying to Cursor, yes, you can use the data that I've used to train your data. And so making sure that you can turn off that privacy mode is a good way also to protect the data that you're using. And then check your institutional policy, right? So for example, here at UCLA, they've given us instructions on what is permitted and prohibited when using Gen AI tools. So here's a table that they told us this is permitted and this is prohibited. So check with your institutional policies on what's allowed and what's not allowed when engaging with these Gen AI tools. All right. Hallucinations, again, because vibe coding favors speed and flow versus sort of understanding and rigor. When you're vibe coding, it really makes it easy to, one, misinterpret the results, right? So thinking that there is a pattern, because a lot of these Gen AI are really good at finding patterns, even though it's not meaningful or it's actually noise. They skip a lot of the assumption checks in your data analysis. So it's not going to check like linearity or homogeneity of variance if you're doing ANOVA, for example. It will not, it will forget a lot of the controls or confounders if you don't put that in your prompts or in your data documentation. So be careful with that. It will also use defaults without questions. Again, this is where prompting really becomes really important because you want to sort of conduct on what your output is going to be, right? And it will analyze fake data even though those variables or data do not exist. And we've done this in some experiment that we did where we actually did not even have any of those variables, but we did not provide any documentation when we were vibe coding. And so it created sort of these fake variables for us and it analyzed it for us and it gave us an output as if they existed. And so it's really important, again, following sort of those workflow where you're providing a lot of documentation, uh, doing a lot of that RAG, as well as good prompt engineering techniques when you're vibe coding. In order to avoid a lot of these hallucinations, I call these out, very important. Use the pointers from that suggested workflow or that diagram that I shared. Clarify the data sources before you're generating codes. Use RAG. Do that structured prompts. Check the codes and run it outside of the code editor because you can actually run a lot of your analysis within the editor itself. But a lot of people do is based on the generated code, they open SAS, Stata, or R again and run the codes from there and not within the code editor, just to make sure that the variables that were generated, the output, it's still verifiable and it's workable. And so there are actually tons of AI code editors out there that you can use for vibe coding. Most of them are free at a certain number of analysis, and then you start paying monthly subscription if you need to do more. So tools like Cursor, Kite, Windsurf, Tab9, Zencoder are all used for vibe coding. I mostly use Cursor because that's what I was trained on by Dr. Go. And so I'll sort of show Cursor sort of what it looks like and how you can interact with it in this very short demo that I'm going to do in a second. All right. So I know that was a lot. That was probably abstract if you've never used vibe coding. But before I do the sort of this quick demo, are there any questions from the group? If not, I'll go ahead and do a quick, Monica.
Deanna had a question in the chat asking about noise in hallucinations and
Uh-huh.
how you defined noise in that context.
Noise in a way. So when you're doing a lot of your data analysis, when you're vibe coding, it might interpret, let's say, a statistical finding from your data analysis when in fact it's not there. So it's sort of increasing a lot of your type 1 errors. If you're just sort of, oh, go ahead and analyze this data without sort of giving a lot of the background and context with what this AI is analyzing. And part of that as well as hallucination, right? So it might be hallucinating because of it's just looking at this data set without you providing a lot of the context. So in a way, that's really what I meant by noise, sort of slash hallucination. I don't know if
Thanks.
that makes sense, but
Yeah, no, that does. I was just trying to figure out how, like like you said, if it's picking up something that's actually not there and
yeah,
making it assume that it's a, so again, that's why you're saying be very careful of how you're even approaching it to begin with.
exactly,
Okay.
exactly.
Okay. Thank you so much. I really
Yeah,
appreciate it.
thanks, Diana. Appreciate.
Yeah, my question is somewhat related and maybe more practice oriented. So I'm using ChatGPT for my code correction stuff. I just
Mm,
cross check, or mostly I use ChatGPT to not go to Stacks Exchange, which I was used to do before,
yeah,
for all my queries. So I just ask ChatGPT, hey, how if I'm forgetting something in
yeah,
ggplot2 or dplyr specifically, so to do those things.
yeah.
But I wasn't able to like go beyond that because just
Mm,
because what you mentioned, like if there is new statistical technique I want to employ,
yeah,
and if I'm not well versed of it, then I cannot trust ChatGPT on the coding, right? So how do
exactly.
you navigate that? Do you like, are there any credible sources, or do you cross check what ChatGPT is saying with some internet based, like let's say tutorials or something? How
Yeah,
do you do that?
yeah, that's a great question. I think one of the slides I said, do not even try to engage with any statistical method or analysis that you're not even familiar with. Because often when you start engaging with vibe coding, right, it will just produce a lot of these output without you even understanding what the output is about. I would say if you're really keen into using a statistical method that you're not familiar with, but you want to use vibe coding, I mean, you still engage with a statistician, right? I mean, I think it's no different with what you're doing now. If there is some type of analysis that you're not familiar with, uh, I often just call a statistician to help me with the analysis. But here, you can sort of start with vibe coding and maybe try to understand what that is, but still verify with with a trusted expert or with a statistician just to make sure that the output that you're generating is actually feasible and it's correct. I have not used vibe coding where I'm not familiar with a method because I'm just afraid that I'm just going to completely have some wrong outputs that I don't even know to read what that is. But I say engage with an expert or a statistician that's familiar with that method, but try it first with vibe coding and see what you get. Some people will triangulate, right? We'll use different types of models. So Claude, uh, Gemini, ChatGPT, etc., and see what type of output they get and see if it's very similar. But the problem with that is some of these are still using the same training data set. And so you might get some biased results out of these models. And so I don't know how I can sort of 100% rely to what all these different models are telling me. So
Okay. Okay. Makes sense. Thank you. And by the way, all these models were basically trained on Reddit's, right? Reddit outputs.
yeah, I mean,
You have to be,
and different types. And I think Stat Exchange maybe, right? A
yeah.
lot of these where they're producing a lot of these codes. So
Yeah.
some of them may not even be reliable, right?
Yeah.
Because a lot of these are maybe even producing the wrong output, and so or the wrong codes. And so that's really important where you really verify the output that is getting
Okay.
produced from these.
One last question before, I don't want to take much time, but this is very interesting. Have you found anything which will allow you to directly integrate uh, any language model with your R software, like R,
Yes.
okay.
So Cursor is one of them.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
So I
So
look forward to demo, whatever
yeah,
you
so
will
let
do.
me go ahead and show
Yeah.
Cursor. So if you're probably using ChatGPT, it's really hard to integrate a lot of your workflow within an integrated sort of environment. A lot of these vibe coding tools help you with that. So Cursor is one of them. And so this one is our sort of synthetic fake data set from UCLA IDRE. But the question really is, can we predict admit to graduate school using GRE, GPA, and then the rank of the undergraduate institution that they were enrolled in, right? So four variables. With this question, right, what type of analysis would you do? In our outcome variable here, admit is a binary admit or don't admit. Very simple. What kind of analysis would we use for this one to predict?
Would it be like a logistic?
A logistic regression, right? So very
Okay.
simple. So we'll do a logistic regression. I've uploaded a codebook description for this one. In the interest of time, I'm just going to sort of, let me see if I can pull, um, sorry. Let me just pull cursor so you guys can see that environment. All right, so this is cursor. And it's sort of divided into these three window. Left is sort of your where all your documents live, right? Earlier I said you need to have some project organization when you're vibe coding, and this is what I meant, where you're sort of creating some folders for your data, the documents that you want AI to refer to, figures, so that this is where all your figures are going to live. Your output, so any of the output generation will be here, and then the scripts. I've already generated a lot of these just to save time. And here in the middle is sort of your window where you see a lot of the interaction produced between you and cursor. And then here is your chat window in AI. And so the way you interact with cursor, very similar to ChatGPT. This is where you sort of just chat with him or her or they. Um, and you put in your prompt here, right? And so I already started and sort of generated the entire prompt for us. And so the first prompt that I asked Cursor is, I said, you're a neuroscientist, statistician, and analyst. We will start an analysis with the research question, how do GRE scores, GPA, rank, predict admission to grad school? Right? I will provide you with a data set and supporting documents to execute this analysis. Do not run the analysis until I tell you to do so. And then write all scripts in R. And so with that prompt, it generated this response and said preparing for the analysis, exploring the workspace, which is this workspace for existing files and data sets. And then it produced all this for me, right? This is the location of my code book. These are the variables. I did not say anything about the variables yet, but it sort of did the analysis for me, right? The admit is binary. You have the variables of GRE, GPA, and rank. You have a sample size of about 400. And then here's the supporting documents. Since I already uploaded those, this is the research question. And then the current status, no R scripts are found. They're ready to create it when I tell them, which is good, right? Because I prompted them not to create any of these scripts yet. And then next steps, it's telling me these are some of the next steps that you can do. right? We can load and explore the data. We can do some descriptive stats, logistic regression for modeling. Again, we didn't say this is a logistic model, but it's sort of already suggested that we can do a logistic regression, and then some diagnostics and validation, and then some interpretation as well. And then in the next few prompts, I'm sort of just saying these are the documents just to prepare for that process of RAG, right? That retrieval augmented generation, just to make sure that I'm feeding Cursor with the documents that I need in order to sort of eliminate or at least reduce some of the hallucination. So here I'm saying create a document called README just to reproduce the workflow. So every time I interact with vibe coding or with Cursor, it will produce those documents for me so that I can sort of trace what we did together. And then I said the code book is in the data set under docs folder. So it created that for me. And then I also created sort of a table for all the variables that I'm using, and I pasted that here, and I told them these are the variables that I'm going to use. This is very simple because we only have 4 variables, but just imagine, right, if you have like 600 variables or 800 variables in your data set. So again, you just want to be very specific and tell Cursor or your Gen AI, these are the variables that I want you to look at, and this is how I want you to look and examining them. And so it created that table for me on the README file, so we can go back to that README file later on. And then the next prompt that I said was, sorry, I know we don't have a lot of time, is a lot of the data processing and data cleaning. So here I'm sort of saying flag the values outside of the expected ranges just to check that I have a clean data set. So it produced a script for me, as you can see it here. This produced the script for me. I did not do any single coding here, but by prompting and sort of data pre-processing and cleaning, it sort of produced all these for me. And then another step, additional data processing for me in terms of sort of cleaning, and it produced all these codes for me that I can run in R or I can run within this code editor. And so the next one is just some preliminary sort of exploratory data analysis. And so I prompted them to do that, and it produced all these for me. So Prashit, in terms of ggplot, right, with a single prompt, it produced all these for me. And then under figures, if you can look at these are all the figures that were produced by a single prompt, where I said, all right, just do a simple data exploration for me, and it produced all these figures for me. And then finally, with our regression model, I said, go ahead and do fit a logistic regression of admit on GRE, GPA, and rank, report odds ratio, 95% CI, p-values, and save a tidy table to output model CSV for me, right? And then after that prompt, it created all these codes for me, as you can see it here. And then it sort of produce a nice summary for me here, right, without the statistical language. But you can still run this in R and run a lot of it and get your R output if you want to see that, and make sure that you're verifying the output. And with this one, we did compare it with the UCLA website. It's exactly similar, 100% similar in terms of the output. And if you look at my output here, I said, put it in the model table. Here it's a CSV file, but you can see it here that it will produce those tables for you as well. So I know we're almost out of time, but I'll stop there to entertain more questions. I know that was very quick, but with Cursor and other vibe coding, it's sort of integrated in this one window, as opposed to like ChatGPT, where you're sort of copying and pasting and then running it in R or in Stata. But with this one, it's sort of all integrated in one interface. So, all right.